Greetings, ladies and metalgents, and welcome to this latest edition of ReTFOS, where I take old stories that I've done and update them to modern standards in video and audio. This particular story is called The Roar, written by RegalLegalEagle. He stood at the edge of the field and listened to the buzz. It sounded far off, subdued, but he knew that it was just the warm-up. Alcohol, narcotics, money, none of that could give him the same sort of feeling as he got listening to the crowd. The game hadn't even begun yet, and he loved it. Just the sound of people moving into place, filling the stadium. The others were all in their meditation chambers, trying to clear their minds and open their spirits for the ritual. They didn't understand the human concept of getting pumped before a game. The cultists were very fond of meditation, reflection, and all that sort of thing. And why not? They were centuries ahead of everyone else in terms of tech. Everyone was reliant on their continued goodwill towards the lesser species. They'd always been rather mysterious and enigmatic. They didn't respond to many diplomatic requests, trade delegations, or even declarations of war. They generally just politely but firmly told the younger species that they had no interest and sent them on their way. No one had ever been to their core worlds before. That is, until Victor. 3 years ago, he'd been just another agri-colony farm kid getting ready for an exciting life of farming dirt. He was good enough at baseball and football and the other football that he might have had a chance of getting a scholarship to a decent school. But instead, 6 months before graduation, a cultist ship crashed into the planet. It was some sort of prototype that had gone wrong. Even gods made mistakes. Miraculously, only one person had been near enough to the impact site to get caught in the blast. Him. He'd been out in the perimeter that morning, checking the fence, when his world exploded. Lost both legs and his left arm, plus the general case of fractured or broken ribs, skull fracture, internal bleeding. Good stuff. To make matters worse, when everyone in the hospital said that he was lucky that he didn't lose his right arm, he got to inform them that he was a lefty. Coming from a family of dirt farmers, he was looking at living the rest of his life with the cheap prosthetics, a fraction of strength of normal limbs, no feeling, lots of phantom pain. Then the cultists showed up. For the first time in history, or human history, at least, they came to us. They apologized and gave his parents a massive sum of money, and only had one condition, that they could take Victor back with them, fix him up, and let him attend one of their own schools to make amends. Well, what could he say? The ambassador was there, the press. He smiled and got propped up for some pictures, said goodbye to his folks, said he'd return or call when he could, and then got taken to the cultist territory. The prosthetics were incredible, better than anything humans could make. It wasn't that they were stronger or could shapeshift or anything like that, but they felt exactly like his real arm and legs. It was like he'd never lost them. When he was doing physical therapy in rehab, they introduced him to the ancient cultist sport to test his reflexes and coordination. Venner. It was like a mix between capture the flag, American football, and hunting. Most species just had a modular obstacle course or a holographic targets, but real courses had small engineered forests and real animals. What would happen if two teams would set up on either side of a forest or obstacle course? Then the animals would be released into the center, and each side had to capture some animals to try and drag them back to their side, carry others into the team side, and just flat out try not to get stomped on by the rest of the animals, or the opposing team. When they'd first explained it to him, he was really confused, but he noticed that the seemingly peaceful cultists got really worked up just talking about it. They'd said that he shouldn't feel bad if he wasn't very good at the game, since in general humans had worse eyesight, less strength, and less speed than cultists. Then to everyone's surprise, including his own, he was amazing at it. First, they'd assumed it was a fluke. He was competing against cultists undergoing physical therapy, after all, so they set him up as their equivalent of a high school team. He crushed. Then they moved him into the equivalent of a college team. After all, they'd offered him to teach him. For the first time in his life, he had important people fighting over him. He got sent to the cultist capital of all places and was enrolled in some fancy school. The coursework they originally gave him was so far beyond his level, it wasn't even funny. So they quickly found him the easiest classes possible for him and told him not to worry about the academics. His first year, he led the team through an undefeated season. They quickly gave him an honorary degree, and he got signed by the Praetorians. Despite the name, the team was the worst in the professional Venom League. Just being signed to any sort of professional team was in itself amazing, however. No other species had ever been offered, so his first professional year in Venna and his second with the Cultists, he carried them onto a staggering 96 wins to 84 loss season. Made more impressive considering they'd been 40 to 140 the previous season. He felt like he would have done even better, but they insisted he rested and sat out every other game. The Cultist players only played one game in 3 themselves. It was a hard, dangerous game. His right arm got broken 3 times in the season. So, when the season was over, they offered him a much larger contract. He turned it down, insisting they use the money to buy better players. Then, he tried to have them replace his right arm with a prosthetic, but voluntary amputation wasn't a concept the Cultists understood. So he took an axe to it in front of the Cultist hospital and let them clean it up and give him a new replacement arm like he wanted in the first place. They thought he was insane. Maybe he was. But this season, he hadn't rested for a single game and the Praetorians had gone undefeated. After sweeping both opposing teams in the postseason, they'd faced off against the Royal Guard, long considered the greatest team in the history of the sport. They had the most funding, the largest base, more Hall of Fame players, and more grand championships than any other team. And they'd made it clear that they were not interested in letting some impetuous little human win the grand championship. That promise had come 3 games ago, and the Praetorians, under Victor's guidance, won every single game. This wasn't what it came down to. One more win meant a completely undefeated regular and postseason. It meant the first time in history of non-cultists would be in the winning team. He'd already been the first human on a professional team, so this was just another record to beat. Plus, the first team in history, any professional team, had gone completely undefeated. It would be broadcast into the entirety of the cultist nation, 92% viewership, 28 billion people, and it wasn't broadcast anywhere else. There wasn't a single human in the crowds out there. It was all cultists, and he knew they were cheering for him. When he'd first left home, he'd expected to be homesick immediately, but instead he'd been focused on recovery, and then he started winning. He'd been to a pro baseball game back home once, farm league pros. The energy at the game had been incredible to him, the cheering, the noise, the pure sensations that it built. But to be on the field, to hear the crowds cheering you on, it was better than anything else he knew. Nothing came close. He wasn't a drinker. The cultists didn't have narcotics for humans, and he wasn't brave enough to try screwing one of the women because he lacked the hard scales on his belly, so her quills would tear him up. All he had was winning. The other players needed to meditate and clear their minds to try and reach some sort of clarity of spirit, like they said, where they could focus on the game and push out what they considered to be noise of the crowd. It was a distraction to them. But Vincent fed off of it. He ate it up and asked for more. He didn't do any kind of showboating because there was no room for it in the sport. He just won over and over and over. He might lose 4 or 5 arms or legs per game, and he just slapped in a replacement and went back out. He never stopped. So when he heard the numb murmur of the crowd, he closed his eyes, imagining what it would sound like when the game was actually going. The rest of the team could sit in their quiet chambers and meditate. He wanted to hear the crowd. "Victor!" He turned back and saw the team manager. He was an old occultist. Quills were grey and his scales were worn-looking. He didn't use artificial polisher like some old occultists did. "They've given your request the all clear. It's waiting for you." Victor just grinned and followed the cultist into what had been set aside as his meditation chamber, though he never used it. Instead of soothing paintings or a Zen garden or anything like that, there was a massive bell waiting inside. "We've hooked it up to the PA system. Press the red button and start ringing. The music will begin. I must admit, it's interesting to use music like this. Do you humans often incorporate music with sport?" "All the time." Victor nodded and rubbed his hands together as he looked at the bell. Might want to get out of here. This will be loud," he said before his manager nodded and left the room. Then Victor pulled on the headphones they'd left him, pressed the red button on the well, and picked up the hammer. He took a slow breath and then slammed the hammer on the bell. It reverberated and rang out through the small room, which was picked up by the speakers. He could imagine the crowds now growing quiet and confused as he kept ringing the bell. It wasn't some little thing just to make noise. It was heavy, deep. It was the sort of bells that only rang for funerals. As he kept ringing the bell, he finally heard the start of the guitar, then the bass. Then the drums came in, the heavy beat matching the tempo of the bell perfectly. Finally, he heard in his headphones, "Victor, it is time." He left the meditation room. The others were lined up in front of the entrance to the field as he heard the music outside, but the crowd was quiet. Then there was the announcer. "And now, welcome your home team, the Praetorians!" The rest of the team began to jog out onto the field as the cheers began. Victor waited a moment as the lyrics of the song progressed and then jumped out onto the field as they hit the cue. "I got my bell. I'm going to take you to hell. I'm going to get you, Satan. Get you. Hell's bells." The roar of the crowd erupted then. He could feel the energy instantly. He could feel the cheering and hollering. He could see them on their feet all around the stadium as he held up his arms. "What's the plan, Victor?" Garnash asked him as he joined them on the field, and they began to run towards the side of the field. "Half of you on defense, the rest on herding." "What, no striking?" Tishkash asked, clearly surprised. "Yeah, I'll be our striker. We're up to 3 games, guys. They know they have to stop us here and now. They'll be pushing their own strikers very hard. Counter it. We can't afford to let this drag on. They've injured 8 of our players. Any more of you go down, we might have to play short on the team. We win today, no doubts, no fears. Victory!" "I don't know how you make your spirit and soul so clear and focused," Kaigan said, with a shake of his head. Victor just laughed. He didn't need meditation to know that he wanted to win. With every fiber of his body, he needed to win. But with the crowd cheering him on, it was fecking invincible. He was 8 feet tall and mean as hell. This was his day. No, this was humanity's day. Even if the nearest human was light years away and had no idea what was going on right now, he vowed to win in the name of humanity. The cultists would cheer. They would roar for him, for humanity. They were approaching the center of the field, where the forest waited for them. Well, the incredibly well-crafted obstacle course that used real trees and rocks and a stream to make it interesting. The open field they were in had 3 sections to it. On either far side were the pens they used to herd their animals into. In the center was essentially a stone well they'd tossed striker animals into. Back in the day, cultists celebrated games by slaughtering the animals in pens and letting the creatures in the well drown. These days, they herded animals had very cushy lives outside of games, and the well would lower the animals into a care of a veterinarian waiting in a special room below it. But, to be honest, Victor wasn't sure that he'd want to win any less bad if he had to slaughter the animals by hand. His desire to win was great, and it amused the cultists greatly that a direct translation of his name basically meant winner. Finally, they heard the horn being blown to signal the start of the game as Kikwa birds screeched and flew out of the forest in the center. The roar of the crowd got a bit more intense for a moment. Then the cultists around him either shifted into more defensive positions or picked up the pace. Victor wasn't as fast as any of them and quickly fell behind. However, he caught up again as they entered the forest. The cultists were careful, sometimes paranoid creatures, always wary of an ambush or trap. They would also see very well, so there were times when teams would spend 15 or 20 minutes planning out ways to trap the enemy team inside the forest, each making moves and counter-moves from across the course. Victor didn't do that. He saw just fine by human standards, but in the thick of the forest that meant that he could see about 10 feet ahead of him at any given time, which meant that he planned 10 feet ahead. He knew where he wanted to go, however, so he just burst through the bushes and past the trees towards the mountain. It wasn't really a mountain, more of a hill at the top of the forest where the stream started. It was where the most valuable striker animals rested, guarded by a very carefully bred and extremely pissed-off crag snapper. Strikers would work in teams to distract it and grab the small animals that hid near the beast. But that took time, and usually meant that the strikers wouldn't try it till later in the game, when they knew that there was no other choice. Not today. Victor kept a good jog as he ignored stealth and kept moving forward. There might be some cultists from the opposing team watching him and laying out some of the very elaborate and well-planned trap right now, but Victor would never know it. Take it as it came. Forge ahead, that's how he kept winning. As he reached the start of the mountain, the trees gave way to rocks, and he had to start moving up the rocky opening, with a little stream trickling down the center. He was hopping over it and building up speed as he hopped from rock to rock, starting to move recklessly fast in what was a dangerous area of the field. He could see the top of the path even out, and before he got to it, he reached up with his left hand and disconnected his right arm at the shoulder, putting it free with a pop. Then he screamed at the top of his lungs and raised the prosthetic arm in the air by the wrist and sprinting in the last few feet over the edge and into the opening beyond. Just what he expected. There was a shallow pond with a whole variety of colorful and exotic creatures around the edges. In the center was the crag snapper. It was essentially an elephant-sized gator with a turtle shell and an incredibly mean disposition. It started to rise from the deeper part of the pond, drawn by Victor's scream as it turned, mouth opening to reveal the massive rows of sharp teeth. But Victor jumped in the air and slammed his prosthetic down on the creature's head so hard that the entire thing cracked and then broke apart, shattering over the snapper's skull. The creature rocked back, stunned, as Victor used the open moor as a springboard to jump onto the creature's back. He ran along it and spotted the loose portion of shell that he knew would be there. Quickly kneeling on the now rocking creature's shell, he flipped the section of shell up with his remaining hand. Inside was a very surprised Gispet, a sort of fox-eared ferret with a fur like a sable, or so he'd been told. He grabbed the creature before it could scamper off and then roughly stuffed it down the front of his own shirt, tugging onto the string that he had fastened to it to pull it tight. It made breathing a bit harder, but it was the easiest way that he could hold onto the critter. At least, the fur was incredibly soft in his chest. Ah! The teeth was less soft, but it would stop after a while. He began to run down the shell of the crag snapper now, seeing the exit from this area heading into the opposing team's territory. He quickly started moving down it as he heard the crag snapper behind him, howled in rage and started to move forward. The rest of the creatures in the area began to move quickly to get out of its way. Soon enough, they were brushing past Victor as they got out of the way of the rampaging snapper. The enclosure was made to keep him stuck up in the mountain, but Victor could hear the shaking and crunching behind him as the creature tried to smash its way through the rock. At the very least, the rest of the animals in the forest were on high alert. Victor was back down in the forest and running for the territory of the enemy team when he burst through a bush and then fell forward as something snagged his foot. He barely caught himself before hitting the ground and narrowly avoiding crushing the gispet in his shirt. He had to practice doing things one-handed to make sure that he was still effective while missing an arm. He turned over and looked back as he saw his foot snagged in a very intricate rope of some sort. The knot itself he recognized as a sort that you'd need two hands to loosen up. Back! This is the end for you, human. Victor looked around for a moment and then saw a cultist shake the dirt from foliage off his quills to get up. We will break you here. You won't win. We can't allow it. You were never meant to get this far. Tell that to my fans, Victor spat back. Even in the dense forest, they could hear the cheering crowd in the stadium around him. There were hidden cameras spread around to let them watch. They were obviously enjoying his progress so far. The fans know nothing, the Xeno growled and swiped at the air. You will not endanger our prestige. Your team loses here. We've kept you from winning for 52 years. This will be no different. Look at you, one-armed and without a creature. What was your plan, anyway? Victor realized the creature didn't know that he had the gispet in his shirt. Just making trouble. You hear that screaming? I pissed off the crag snapper. It's trying to break out of the mountain. You didn't. I did. The cultist looked at him and then back towards the mountain. He knew as well as Victor that his team would need help trying to herd animals through the path of the angry snapper. This isn't over. Your leg is caught. You go nowhere. The Xeno growled and then turned, sprinting towards the sound of the crag snapper, smashing apart the crafted mountain. Vincent tugged at the snare then, but he wasn't strong enough to pull it apart one-handed. He couldn't just pop off his leg either. How the hell would he get to the enemy well? He looked around and then grabbed a nearby rock, wincing a bit as he prepared himself and started slamming the rock down on his prosthetic foot. He was soon gasping and crying in pain as he did. The rules allowed for his fake limbs because they weren't any stronger than he would have had if they were real. But so long as they were connected, they'd feel pain just like a normal limb. Normally, he'd just disconnect the thing and be done with it. But this time, he kept smashing the foot, hearing it crack and splinter before it was broken enough for him to pull the stump of his ankle free. Grabbing a nearby tree, he pushed himself up and tested his weight on the stump before screaming out in white, hot agony. Reaching up, he snapped a branch off of the tree, testing it as a very crappy but functional crutch. Then he leaned a bit and started hopping. He could push off the stump a bit and grit his teeth, ignoring the pain as he moved. When he got to the edge of the forest, he saw an empty field. They'd sent everyone into the forest, no defenders. He laughed and kept hopping forward. Then he heard the crowd roar out as they saw him emerge. Victor! Victor! He grinned and tried to move faster. He was about halfway to the well when he heard the scream of agony behind him. The cultists had come back, obviously knowing something was up when it heard the chant. Crap! Victor tried hobbling forward faster. The cultist was sprinting as hard as he could towards him from behind. He could hear the chanting of the crowd and finally just tossed the branch behind him, putting more weight onto the stump and screaming in agony with every step. But also, every step brought him closer. With one hand, there was no way that he could get the gispet out to toss it into the well, not with the cultist so close behind. He moved closer and closer. Victor! 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 He was so fecking close. He heard the footsteps behind him. He could hear the cultists' ragged breathing. Victor! They were chanting his name, stomping their feet. 100,000 people here in the stadium. 28 billion people watching live. Victor! He was screaming non-stop now as he moved forward. He was at the edge of the well and he didn't know what to do still, so he just tumbled forward, nearly cracking his skull on the far side as his knees slammed into the side of the well and he began to tumble into it. Just when he thought he was in and the points would be his, he stopped. He looked up and saw the cultist clutching his intact right leg by the foot. No! No! Victor reached up with his remaining hand and popped the release in his thigh. No! The cultist screamed in dismay as Victor now continued to fall into the well. He didn't know what would happen. The animals would fall gently into a veterinarian's facility to be cared for in case they were injured during the game. But the heaviest they weighed was like 10 kilograms. Victor might literally be too heavy and just plummeted to his death here. He felt something pluck at his face, like a hand trying to stop his fall by pressing on his cheek. Then there were others, but he was still moving quickly as he fell through the fake bottom of the well and got flipped around so his back hit the padded area with a heavy thud. He lay there for a few moments and then finally spoke. Ow! A team of cultists rushed into the padded area then, pulling his shirt off and pulling the gispet out. The creature looked surprised, but not harmed. Then the Xenos glanced at one another and back down at Victor, who just started laughing before groaning. He'd definitely fractured some ribs in that. What happens now? He finally asked. Yeah, you're out of the game, one said. Did the gispet points count? He looked around at the obviously confused and surprised faces. We don't know. The rules must be checked. Well, then get me a wheelchair or a new pair of legs and another arm and get me topside. I have to cheer my team on. What? But you're out of the game. I can't compete, but I can cheer. I can roar. You hear the crowd? They're shouting victory! Victory! They want us to win. Get me up there. So long as he had breath in his lungs, he'd urge his team on, by playing or by roaring. Soon enough, his voice was amongst the many in the crowd, cheering as loud as they could while they watched. Before, the roar was for him. It might be again. But now, the roar was for his team. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Lightjock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.